Hello, I'm Evan with New Life for Old Bikes. In this episode, we're going to be servicing the wheel bearings on my 1976 Huffy Independence. What I'm doing here applies to almost any bike. As we go through, I'll point out some exceptions and differences that you need to look for. Since this particular bike has caliper brakes, the first thing we're going to do is remove the air pressure from the tires. This way we'll be able to slide the wheel between the brake pads. All I have to do on a set of V brakes is grab the brakes, compress them, and remove the cable. It's that simple. If your bike happens to have disc brakes, this step does not apply to you. If your bike has a quick release, simply release it, loosen it up, and drop the wheel out. This particular bike takes a 13 millimeter wrench. So I'm going to loosen this side with a 13 millimeter. And someone has changed out the bolt on the other side. And so I'm using a crescent wrench because that's what I happen to have that's handy. And we're going to drop the wheel out of the frame. This particular bike also has some locks to prevent the wheel from coming off. Next, we're going to release the pressure in the back tire so we can sneak that past the brake pads. This particular wheel takes a 15 millimeter wrench. Again, if you have quick releases, simply loosen them and drop the wheel out. Once we've loosened the bolts, pull the derailleur back and your wheel will drop right out. My goodness, the back axle on this one is very bent. I've removed the nut from this side of the wheel and I'm spinning it so you can see how badly bent the axle on this is. I've checked on evilBay and an axle can be had anywhere from about $8 to $11. Fortunately, I've got a basement full of bicycle parts and I will find a used axle that will fit this. Since the axle was bent on this bicycle, I'm going to check the rear dropouts to make sure that they're still straight. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the derailleur from the bike. In this particular case, I'm just simply using a crescent wrench, loosening it up, and dropping it out. The next thing I'm going to do is I've got two steel rods with a couple of nuts in them, and what I'm doing, I'm just simply using this to determine if the frame is square or not. As you can see, I'm just simply bolting this where the wheel was on both sides, and I just have to make sure that the wheel lines up. And then just simply twist a little bit to make sure that it does. And that is now perfect. There are several tools you'll need to do this project. The first is optional. That's a magnetic tray. I simply like that because it keeps all my parts in one spot. The cat can't knock them over. The next is either an adjustable wrench or a 17 millimeter wrench. The next is a cone wrench. This is specialized. You'll notice it's much thinner than a standard wrench. The last item is also optional. It's a magnet. I use this to pull the bearings out of the wheel. It makes it a whole lot easier for me. Before we start, I've covered my wife's antique table with a towel. Two reasons for this. First is so my wife doesn't get upset with me for scratching the table. And second, I really hate when parts go bouncing off the table and hit the floor. At this point, they would just bounce onto the cloth and stay. At this point, if your bike has a skewer or a quick release holding the wheel in place, you need to go ahead and remove it. We're going to start by working on the non-drive side of the wheel. That's the side of the wheel that doesn't have the gears. We're going to take our 15mm cone wrench and we're going to slide it into the slot behind the lock nut. We're going to take our 17mm wrench and we're going to loosen it. At this point, you might want to get a quick photo to make sure you know how to get it back together. I'm going to take my parts and put it in my magnetic tray. If you are working on the front wheel, it doesn't matter which side you unbolt. When we've removed the cone from the axle, we're going to check it for any pitting and make sure it's not damaged and put it in our tray. Next, we'll remove the axle. At this point, my magnet becomes very handy. See how easy it is to pull out those bearings? There are 9 bearings in each side. This is why I put a towel under the wheel to catch any bearings that fell out. Just a quick note here. I measured the distance between the end of the axle and the first nut before I moved the parts to the new axle. At this point, I'm simply going to put all the parts into a solvent. My solvent of choice is mineral spirits. Once I've removed everything from the mineral spirits and cleaned it, I will inspect each part to make sure there is no damage. It's a whole lot easier to replace bearings now than after they fail. Another quick note here, your bearings may be in a race like this instead of just loose bearings like mine had. If they are, make sure that you clean inside the race real well. I've cleaned the freewheel on this bicycle, but I didn't bother to remove it. It was just so incredibly smooth. A freewheel doesn't have a seal in it, and so once I got everything cleaned, I squirted a penetrating oil into the freewheel and then wiped it from the back with a rag just to check to make sure there wasn't any dirt and debris in there. When there wasn't, I followed it with some chain oil. I'm not going to take that one off. It's way too smooth. I've gotten all the parts cleaned up. They're all ready to go. Everything looks good. There's no damage on any of it. The next step is going to be putting grease into, it's right in there where the race is. Normally I would do this with a grease gun, but I wanted to show you that you don't have to have any special tools for this. So I'm using a Q-tip. Once I've gotten plenty of grease in there, my next step is going to be to take a pair of tweezers and to put each ball bearing back in. This is far less time consuming if you have the freewheel off the wheel. But as discussed, this particular freewheel was in beautiful shape, so we didn't bother to do that. Once I've inserted all my bearings, I'm going to flip it over and do exactly the same thing on the other side. Again, you could do this with a grease gun. It would be fairly easy if you did. But we don't have to have a grease gun. A Q-tip works just fine. Once we have the bearings in place, I'm going to do the same thing on each of the cones. I'm going to make sure there's plenty of grease on it. Next, I'm going to lift the wheel up and slide the axle through from the drive side. Then I'm going to install the cone on the non-drive side of the wheel. Again, this is 15 millimeter. You can either use a wrench or your fingers and tighten it down, whichever is the easiest for you. Once the cone is in place, we're going to put our washer and our lock nut back on. The last thing I'm going to do is use my 15 millimeter cone wrench and tighten the lock nut with my 17 millimeter wrench. Then I'm going to test the bearing. We want it to run smoothly, but we don't want it to be loose. Fantastic. Next, I'm going to disassemble, clean, put fresh grease on, and reassemble the front wheel. The only difference between the front wheel and the back wheel is the size of the cone wrench and the size of the lock nuts are slightly different. It's also nice that I don't have to contend with the gears on one side of this wheel to get in the way. This one will be a whole lot easier to get at the bearings. As it turns out, the front bearings are in a race. If you'll notice, one of the ball bearings fell out of the race. It's actually chewed up pretty badly. About half of it is missing. Fortunately, there was no damage to any other parts of the bike, so I'm just going to be putting a new bearing where the old one came out right here. Just like on the back wheel, all I'm doing is putting some grease into the race on both sides. I want you to notice there's a seam in the bearing. What I'm doing is I'm going to try to fill that seam with grease. Once I've filled that seam with grease, I'll go ahead and drop it in. On the cone, make sure that you've filled the void with grease. Next, slide the axle in from the back. And screw down the cone on the other side. The rest will be exactly like the back wheel. Just make sure that the bearings are snug, but not binding and not loose. To reinstall the back wheel, I'm simply going to pull the wheel in, pull the derailleur back, and slide the chain around the smallest gear. Make sure the washers are out of the way, and slide the wheel up back through the frame. Last, take our 15mm wrench and tighten the wheel. Make sure that your wheel is centered in the frame. There we go. I went through my parts bin and found a matching nut for the front wheel, so both would be the same size. Simply slide it up through the brakes into the frame. This particular one has a lock on it. Install that lock and put the nut on the other side. Now I can take my 13mm wrench and tighten both sides. Make sure you have this centered. The last thing we're going to do is pump up the tires on this bike. If you have any questions, please note them in the comments below. And please remember, like and subscribe.